Hi guys, it's Catherine. So today I'm making a review of the book Sight by Jessie Greengrass, which is one of the books longlisted for this year's Women's Prize for Fiction. And it was one that I've heard quite a lot about and I was really excited to read, although all I really knew about it before going into it was that it's about pregnancy. It's actually hard to say a lot more about it than this in terms of plot because it doesn't have much of that. It's definitely more a book of ideas, and so I just thought I would talk through some of the ideas in the book and my response to them. To summarise the premise, it's about a woman in her 20s who's pondering whether or not to have a child, and the narrative is interspersed with sections earlier in her life when her mother is ill and also dealing with her mother's death and the aftermath and her grief coming out of that, and also other sections of the text in which she's already had one daughter and she's pregnant with her second child. And none of this is a spoiler. There's nothing you really can spoil in this book. Everything that is within the plot is very evident right from the beginning of the book. The woman also has an interest in the history of the body and medical perceptions of the body, and there are quite lengthy discussions within this book around various moments throughout history that have been quite seminal in medicine, particularly the invention of the X-ray, the first caesarean section, and also the birth of psychoanalysis. Overall, I thought this was a very well crafted book. The author's intellect inflects every single sentence of it, and it was a much more academic read than the vast majority of novels that I've read. It's just under 200 pages and I read it very slowly, not because it's extremely complex, but just because I felt like every sentence required a little bit unravelling in my mind before I moved on. It's definitely not a book for everyone, and I think even I would have found it quite pretentious a couple of years ago, but my tolerance for unusual style has definitely increased recently, and overall I did really enjoy the writing. It has loads of moments of really smart writing and also just really beautiful prose as well, and it launches you straight into that from the very first page. And I thought I would read a few lines just from that first page to get a feel for the writing. She's in the garden of her house watching her daughter play. She has begun to lose, lately, the tumbling immediacy of toddlerhood. I notice it when we walk together, our strides separate, or when we sit face to face across a table, how she is taller now and straighter and inflects her actions with intent. Once her thoughts broke like weather across her face, but that readable plasticity is gone and she is not so transparent. Complexity has brought concealment. The weight of her body when I lift her takes me by surprise, its unfamiliarity a reiteration of the distance between us. This book takes the topic of motherhood and the implications of pregnancy and the birthing of something that is at once you and yours but also separate, and it studies this under a microscope in much more detail than almost any other book that I've read. Linked to this idea of how we can differentiate between mother and child, Greengrass also explores the history of perceptions of the body both internally and externally and how we can come to know and understand ourselves through science. There was so much in here that I found really thought-provoking, such as the necessary separation that is brought with a child growing between the mother and that child, and also the way that traditional hierarchies between mother and child is upended by illness when the narrator finds herself having to care for her terminally ill mother. It explores the shrinking physical distance between her and her mother as the mother becomes more ill and unable to look after herself, and how to compensate out of this grows greater emotional distance. I think there's a lot about distance throughout this book, both tangible and perceived, and I think it's really well done. There was also an analogy that I liked, that giving birth to a child is in a way akin to an amputation. A part of you is removed that can never be restored, and although this seems like a very negative way to view motherhood, I think in a way it is accurate to how a lot of mothers feel in that pain of separation from their child as they begin to grow up and become their own individual person. I like that it represented the decision to become a mother as a monumental, life-altering decision, because that's what it is, and I feel like so often it's represented in media as an eventuality rather than any sort of actual autonomous choice that a woman has. It's unfortunately still seen as unnatural for a woman not to want to be a mother, And I thought the narrator's agonising over this huge decision was actually really refreshing in this book, because it's so often glossed over in the media, and a woman who doesn't want to be a mother is seen as a bad person. I think it's also realistic in its discussion of the pressures that mothers face and the expectation of them to be always happy and grateful, when in reality mothers, it's pretty normal for them to want to be away from their children sometimes, and some mothers do feel regret over having children. I think pregnancy is treated in a really interesting way in this book as well, because I think in lots of media the state of pregnancy is represented as an empowering one. And although it definitely can be, I can't speak from experience, but I'm sure for a lot of women the feeling of being pregnant is not always one of empowerment. Greengrass talks about the state of pregnancy as a reduction of the female form to only flesh, and especially the process of giving birth is a stripping away of any dignity that you have as a woman. And I really like that this book dealt with the issues surrounding pregnancy, birth and motherhood in much more complex and nuanced ways than most other books and other media that I have experienced. I enjoyed watching Jennifer's review from the channel Insert Literary Pun Here of this book, and I'll link it below, and she was quite critical of it in parts, and she raised some issues that I also had while I read this book, although I think overall I was definitely more forgiving of it than she was. There are aspects of this book which undermine its logical foundation. For example, I think most strikingly, the absence of any kind of financial concerns of the female protagonist. Especially after her mother dies, she spends what seems like months just in limbo, going to libraries and reading, when I think the reality for most women is that financial concerns are foremost in their minds. She doesn't seem to have any clearly defined job, and she also doesn't seem to have any colleagues, friends or other family members. And although her husband does have a part in this book, his role is only ever defined in relation to her mental state. He is certainly not an individual character of his own. I don't think any woman's experience is actually like the one portrayed in this book, but I do feel like I do understand what Greengrass is trying to achieve with this. I think it would be really disruptive to the intellectual engagement of this book if the narrative was suddenly disrupted by the female protagonist going out for drinks with her friends. I suppose the reader is meant to assume that the woman does have a life out with that is portrayed in the narrative, but that for the purposes of this book, all that is left out to leave an extremely introspective novel that takes place entirely within this woman's mind. I really love introspective books, and I don't need a lot of plot or characterisation to really enjoy a book if it deals with the themes at its centre very skillfully, and I do think this book was very adept at achieving that. I did feel like it was a bit undermined by its lack of bearing to real life, and I did think some of the really torturous thoughts that this woman's having are a little bit extreme. But I do think overall that this book is not meant to be a representation of how one woman would deal with the issues surrounding motherhood, but rather a representation of a culmination of all issues that surround motherhood and pregnancy that women can feel. All in all, I don't think I've ever really read another book that's quite like this, and I've certainly not read a book about pregnancy or motherhood in this way before, which is quite shocking because those are issues that so many people in our society deal with. But it's still a bit of a taboo when it comes to books, because I suppose it's not considered an appropriate topic when it's assumed that men would never want to read a book that is about an experience that is pertinent only to women. Although I don't think it's a perfect book, I was certainly very impressed by it, both in the sense that Greengrass's writing is very impressive, and also that there were definitely passages that left an impression on me. I think this book is not for everyone. I'm sure there's lots of people who would really hate it, but I've been really enjoying quite offbeat books recently and looking for something that is pushing the mould a little bit, and I think that definitely fits into this category. I think if you're interested in the kind of intellectual debate surrounding the topics that I've talked about in this video, then you should definitely give this book a read, and I did overall really enjoy it. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and let me know what you thought of this book if you've read it already, or if you're still planning on reading it after watching this video. And I will hopefully see you soon with some more reviews of the Women's Prize for Fiction longlist. I'll see you soon. Bye bye.